The advertisement had been folded into the back of a seed catalog, tucked between a page on drought-resistant rye and one on the proper spacing of fence posts. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for information on hard red winter wheat, which the woman at the lending library in Salina had told her was on page 41. And it was, but the catalog had been used as something to press between. And when she opened it, the advertisement fell out and landed face up on the table. She read it once. Then she read it again. A man in Comanche County needed someone who could keep a house and was not frightened by hard seasons. The work would be steady, the situation honest. He had written the word honest twice, which she thought was either a good sign or a bad one, and she had not yet decided which. She was 28 years old. She had come to Salina 3 months earlier from a place she did not discuss, carrying a wool coat, a set of good knives wrapped in oilcloth, and the habit of being very still when she was thinking something through. She had been working at the laundry on Birch Street since her 2nd week, taking in other people's linen and returning it pressed and folded. And she had been saving the kind of money that would not last forever. She folded the advertisement along its crease and put it in her coat pocket and walked back to the laundry. She did not answer it for 11 days. When she did, she kept her letter short. He wrote back in 8 days. The handwriting was even and unornamented. He said she could come on the 23rd if that suited her, and that he would meet her at the depot in Coldwater, and that the work was harder than the advertisement had made it sound, and he wanted her to know that before she came. She thought about that last part for a long time. She came on the 23rd. The depot at Coldwater was small and smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. She stood on the platform with her bag at her feet and her coat buttoned to the throat and watched the other passengers disperse toward wagons and waiting families until the platform was mostly empty. She had been standing there perhaps 5 minutes when a man came around the side of the building from the direction of the stock pens. He was not what she had pictured, though she had tried not to picture anything. He was tall in a way that looked like it had cost him something, like the years of bending through low doorways had taken a toll he'd stopped accounting for. His coat was clean, but the elbows were worn through to a lighter color. He walked without urgency. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her the way she had come to recognize in men who worked outside. Not assessment of the usual kind, not the kind that wanted something, but the kind that was simply gathering information the way you'd check a fence line for weakness before trusting your weight to it. He said, "You're the one who wrote." She said, "I am." He picked up her bag before she could reach for it. Not a gesture, just efficiency. He was already walking toward the wagon before she had taken a step, and she fell in beside him without being asked. The wagon was older than she was, but kept with the kind of attention that meant someone cared about not losing things before they had to. The horses were thin. Not cruelly so. Thin the way animals get when the land they are working is asking more from them than it is giving back. She knew that look. She had seen it on people. He said, "It's about 90 minutes out," she said. "All right." He didn't speak again for a long time. She watched the country instead. The grass on either side of the road had gone the color of old straw, and the sky was the flat white of a sheet of paper left out in the sun too long. She could see where the creek beds ran by the darker lines of scrub willow along their banks, and several of those lines were not dark enough. Trees that were managing but not thriving. The water table had dropped. She could see it in the spacing of the willows, the way they'd thinned at their crowns. She did not say any of this. After a time, he said, "The place is called the Tatum Ground. My father built the house. I've had it 11 years, she said. What happened to the wheat?" He looked at her sidelong. He said, "What makes you think something happened to it?" She said. The elevator in town was quiet for a Saturday. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 2 bad years running. The first year was the weather. Second year was the seed. I put in the same variety and it didn't take." She said, "What variety?" He said, "Turkey red." She said, "That's what everyone around here is planting." He said, "It's what grows." She said, "It's what used to grow." He didn't answer that. The road bent south, and the land opened up, and she could see in the distance the low shape of a house and a barn and several outbuildings arranged the way a careful man arranges things, with thought for the prevailing wind and the angle of the afternoon sun. Someone had built that place to last. She could see it even from a distance. He pulled up on the small rise before the road went down to the yard. The way a man does when he has been looking at something so long he forgets that other people are seeing it for the first time. She looked at it without speaking. The barn was solid. The house was level. The near field had been turned, but nothing was in it, which was right for the season. But the far field, the one to the east that she could see from here, had a wrong look to it. Not dead. Wrong, she said. What's in the east field? He said. Nothing now. I planted it in spring, and it came up thin and went yellow by July. She said, same seed as the near field? He said, same seed as everything. She said, how long has that field been running the same variety? He looked at her. He said, my father planted turkey red. She nodded. She did not say anything else until they reached the yard. There was a hand named Voss who came out of the barn when they pulled in. He was perhaps 50, with a long face and careful eyes, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who have survived things by not drawing attention to themselves. He looked at her without expression, and then looked at the man beside her, and then looked back at her bags and said, she's got more than one. He said she does. Voss looked at her again. Something in his face made a decision. He said, I'll put the horses up. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. Voss saw that whatever decision his face had made seemed to settle further. The house had 4 rooms. The one she was given was off the back, behind the kitchen, with a window that faced southeast and let in the light from mid-morning through afternoon. There was a cot and a hook on the wall and a small table with one leg that had been shimmed with a folded piece of leather to keep it level. She unpacked in the order she always unpacked. Practical things first. Her knives went on the windowsill. Her extra shirtwaist went on the hook. Her tin of lard, her case of needles, her small leather notebook with the pencil tucked in the spine went onto the table, which wobbled slightly and then didn't. When she came back through the kitchen, she found the stove cold and the wood box half empty and a cast iron pan on the shelf that hadn't been seasoned properly in what looked like at least 2 seasons. She found wood under the lean-to and kindling behind the door, and she built the fire before she looked for anything else. By the time either of the men came in, she had located the dried beans, the salt pork, the cornmeal, and a small sack of onions that were still good on the inside, even if the outside had gone soft. He came through the kitchen door, stopped, looked at the fire, looked at her. She said, do you have more salt pork than this? He said, there's a side in the cellar. She said, I'll need it. He went and got it without argument. She noted that. Voss came in a few minutes later and sat at the end of the table and folded his hands on the surface in front of him the way a man does when he has learned that waiting is more efficient than asking. She put food on the table. He looked at his bowl and said, That was all he said. She counted it as a positive assessment. The man ate without speaking. He ate all of it. When he was finished, he set his bowl near the basin and went back outside. And after a moment, Voss did the same. And she washed up alone in the quiet with the fire going, and the window going dark above the basin, and the first stars appearing over the far ridge like something being remembered. She slept in the room off the kitchen. The cot was narrow, but the blanket was adequate, and the window latch worked, which she had not assumed. She lay in the dark and listened to the house and the land around it. The barn was quiet. Somewhere far off a coyote said something once and then thought better of it. She thought about the east field, the way it had looked from the rise, the particular yellow-gray of wheat that has given up. She had seen that color before. She knew what caused it. She was awake before the sky changed. She dressed in the dark and built the fire and had coffee heating before either of them came in from the bunkhouse. He came in first. He stopped in the doorway the same way he had the night before. She said without turning around, I want to look at the east field today. He said, ground's frozen most mornings. She said, that's fine. He sat down. She set a plate in front of him. He looked at it for a moment and then said, you don't have to do all this, she said. I know. He picked up his fork. After breakfast, she pulled on her coat and took the short-handled spade from the lean-to, the one that had been used and cared for, and used some more until it had the particular shine of a good tool that someone had respected. She walked the east field from the north end to the south. He came with her but stayed a few steps back, which she appreciated. She did not want commentary. She wanted to look. The field ran about 40 acres. She walked the rows the previous wheat had been planted in, which were still faintly visible in the turned earth, and she crouched twice and pressed her hand flat against the soil and felt the temperature of it at the surface and just below. Then she took the spade and opened the earth in 3 places, spaced widely, and crouched over each gut and looked. What was inside? He watched but did not ask. At the 3rd cut, she stayed down for a long time. The soil at 6 inches was a color that should not have been that color. Too pale, almost ash gray at the edges where it met the topsoil. She put 2 fingers in and rubbed them together and felt what she was feeling for. She stood, she said. "How long has this field been in wheat?" He said. "Since my father." She said. "Has anything else ever been in it?" He thought about that. He said. "He might have run cattle on it the first few years," she said. "Nothing else? No legumes? No sorghum?" He said. "Not that I know of." She looked at the field, then she looked at him. She said, "The soil is exhausted, not ruined, exhausted. Wheat takes nitrogen out of the ground and doesn't put anything back. You've been planting the same crop in the same place for 30 years, and the ground has run out of what that crop needs." He looked at the field. He had the expression of a man hearing something he has been circling around without naming for some time. She said, "This isn't about the variety. Turkey red is a fine variety. The seed isn't the problem." He said, "Then what do I do with 40 acres I can't grow wheat on?" She said, "You don't grow wheat on it. Not yet. You rest it or you put something in it that gives back what the wheat took out." He said, "What?" She said, "Clover. Or field peas if you want something you can sell. They fix nitrogen. Give it 1 season with the right cover crop, and the wheat will come back in the 2nd year stronger than it's been in 20. He was quiet for long enough that the wind came through from the north and went. He said, "I've never grown peas." She said, "I know." He said, "Do you?" She said, "I grew up on a farm in Indiana that my uncle ran the same way you've been running this one. When he finally listened to my aunt, it took 2 years, and after that he couldn't keep up with the yield." He looked at her, not the way he'd looked at her the first time, checking for structural soundness. Something different now, something that was trying to decide how much weight a new thing could hold. He said, "What happened to your uncle's farm?" She said, "He sold it when he was 72. Got 3 times what he paid for it." He said, "And your aunt?" She said, "She outlived him by 9 years and was perfectly cheerful about it." Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. He turned and looked at the field again. She turned with him. They stood there a moment, both looking at the same 40 acres. He said, "I'd need seed," she said. "I know where to order it," he said. "It'd have to be a small order. Money's tight until the near field comes in." She said, "I know. I looked at the ledger this morning." He turned and looked at her. She said, "It was on the table. It wasn't closed." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back toward the house and she fell in beside him, and they walked back across the near field in the thin morning light without speaking, which by now she had come to understand was simply how the 2 of them did things. Not silence from discomfort. Silence because they were both still working the problem, and the problem did not need words yet. Voss was at the barn when they came back, and he looked at her face and then at the man's face and said, "East Field." She said, "East Field." He said, "I figured." He went back into the barn. She ordered the field pea seed through the co-op in Coldwater, paid for half of it herself, and wrote it into the ledger under her own name on the credit side. He came in and saw it and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he sat down at the table and said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I know." He said, "I'll pay you back." She said, "I know that too." He looked at what she had written. The figures were clear and the columns were straight. He said, "The ledger's been a disaster since Marin left." She said, "Who's Marin?" He said, "My wife." He said it the way people say the name of a thing that has become a fact rather than a feeling, the way you say the name of a town you used to live in. She kept the books. She passed 4 winters ago. She let that settle. She said, "I'm sorry." He nodded once. He got up and poured his own coffee and stood at the window. She went back to the ledger. The seed came in on a Thursday 2 weeks later than she had wanted, but early enough if the ground thawed on schedule. She and Voss put it in over 3 days, while the man worked the near field and kept an eye on the weather coming in from the northwest. The work was straightforward but not easy. The earth in the east field had the particular resistance of ground that had been asked too much and was skeptical about being asked again. She worked without conversation. Voss worked beside her and matched her pace without complaint. And after the first day, didn't bother commenting on how far they'd gotten, because she clearly already knew. The third evening, when they finished the last row, she stood at the south end of the field and looked north along what they'd done. The light was going, and the furrows were straight, and there was nothing to see yet. Nothing would show for weeks. But she stood there anyway. Voss stood beside her. He said, "You've done this before." She said, "Yes." He said, "Not on wheat ground." She said, "On ground that needed to be listened to." Voss was quiet a moment. Then he said, "He doesn't listen to ground much. He's been listening to what the ground used to say." She said, "I know." He looked at her sideways. He said, "You going to stay?" She looked at the field. She said, "Ask me in the spring." He said, "I'm asking now." She didn't answer. After a moment, he nodded once and picked up the seed bag and walked back toward the barn, and she stood in the last of the light and looked at the east field until she couldn't see it anymore. The winter was harder than the fall had suggested. There were 3 weeks in January when the temperature didn't come above 15, and the water pails froze solid by midnight and had to be carried into the kitchen to thaw. She built the fire every morning before dawn. She kept the books in the evenings. She learned that he took his coffee without sugar and that he read in bed with a lantern until later than she would have expected, and that when he was working through a problem, he went quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, denser, more concentrated, like something being pressed down before it was released. She learned these things the way she learned most things, without comment, without storing them as anything larger than what they were. One evening in February, he came in from the barn with a cut on his palm where the ice-stiffened leather had given way and taken the skin with it. She was at the table with the ledger. He went to the basin and ran water over it, and she got up and got the cloth from the shelf without being asked, and he held his hand out without being asked, and she wrapped it and tied it off, and he went back to the basin and she went back to the table. He said, "Thank you." She said, "The south fence line needs checking." Voss said, "There's a post heaved up by the frost." He said, "I saw it." She wrote a number in the ledger column. He said, "I'll get to it Thursday." She said, "All right." He stood at the basin a moment longer, looking out the dark window. She watched him without appearing to. He had the look of a man who was about to say something and was deciding whether it was worth the effort of saying it. Then he dried his hands on the towel and went to bed, and she went back to the column of numbers. She was not lonely. She examined this fact a few times that winter the way you check a wall you have recently repaired, pressing against it to see if it holds. It held. She was not certain yet what that meant. The field peas broke ground on a Tuesday in late March, exactly when she had calculated they would. She found out because Voss came to the kitchen door at first light with mud on his boots and said, "East field." And she said, "I know." And he said, "You haven't seen it." And she said, "I know what it looks like." And he said, "Come look anyway." And something in his voice made her put down the spoon and come. The seedlings were small and very green against the pale brown of the soil. They ran in even rows from the north end of the field, and there were more of them than she had allowed herself to calculate on, because calculation before a thing happened felt like counting a debt you weren't sure you'd owe. He was already there. He was standing at the edge of the field with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the rows the way she had stood at them in the fall, when there was nothing to see. She walked up beside him. He said, without turning, "How long before they fix the nitrogen?" She said, "The roots are working now. By the time we turn them under in June, the field will be ready," he said. "And then wheat in fall," she said. "If you want wheat in fall. Or you could rest it another season and get even more back." He said, "What would you do?" She looked at the seedlings. She said, "I'd push for fall wheat, not because it's the patient choice, because you need the money and the field can handle it." He turned and looked at her. She kept her eyes on the rows. He said, "Marin used to say I was bad at asking for help." She said she wasn't wrong. He was quiet. She said, "You did ask. That's what the advertisement was." He looked back at the field. After a moment, he said, "I suppose it was." They stood there until the light came fully over the east ridge, and the field peas caught it and went from dark green to the particular clear color of a thing that is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Spring came on with more rain than anyone had expected, and the near field of turkey red came in thick and strong. And she managed the books while he managed the land, and Voss managed everything that didn't fit into either category, which turned out to be a great deal. 2 young men from a neighboring county came on for the growing season. She fed them without ceremony. They were polite and worked hard and didn't ask questions, which she appreciated. There was a morning in May when she was in the east field, checking the pea plants for aphids, moving down the rows with her head down and her fingers turning the leaves, and she heard him come up behind her but didn't look up. He stood at the end of the row for a moment and then crouched and began checking the plants on the other side, mirroring what she was doing, moving at the same pace. They went the length of the row without speaking. At the end of it, she straightened and looked at what they'd checked, and he straightened beside her. She said, "No aphids yet," he said. "No," she said, "it's early." He said, "Yes." They moved to the next row. The east field was turned under in the second week of June. She watched from the fence line while he ran the plow. Pea plants went under dark and soft, and she could smell the green of them coming up from the turned earth, the particular smell of something being broken down into what it would become next. Voss stood beside her for a while, and then went back to the barn, and she stayed until the last row was done, came back to the fence and stopped and looked at what was behind the plow. Dark soil, darker than it had been in the fall by a shade that was not dramatic but was real. She said, "Give it 2 weeks and then we'll test it." He said, "I don't have a kit." She said, "I do." He looked at her sideways. She said, "I ordered it in January." He said, "Of course you did." She said, "You would have too if you'd thought of it." He said, "I didn't think of it." She said, "I know." He looked at the turned field for another moment. Then he said, "I'd like to put in 60 acres of wheat this fall." "The near field and the east field together," she said. "That's a significant increase." He said, "I know. I'd need another hand." She said, "You'd need 2." He said, "I know that too." She said, "I can run the numbers tonight and see what the margin looks like." He said, "I'd appreciate that." She turned and started walking back toward the house. He fell in beside her. They walked along the fence line with the field on one side and the afternoon light on the other. And she thought about the numbers she'd run that evening and what they'd show, which she already had a rough sense of. The margin would be tight, but it would hold if the fall wheat came in the way the soil was going to support it coming in now. She was nearly certain of that. She was not quite certain, but she was closer to certain than she had been about most things in a long time. And she had learned to tell the difference between the two. And she had learned to work confidently inside that difference, rather than waiting for the certainty that sometimes never came. The wheat went in on a Saturday in late September, with all 4 of them working. She and Voss driving the second drill, while he and the newer hand ran the first. And it went in straight and even and at the right depth, and by evening the east field had a purpose again that it hadn't had since before he was born. That night she was at the table with the ledger when he came in and set something on the corner of it. She looked at it without picking it up. It was a clipping from the county agricultural report, a short paragraph about nitrogen fixation and cover cropping. The paragraph had been circled in pencil. She looked up. He said, "I found it in the extension office records from 12 years ago." He said it plainly, not as apology, as the way he said most things. She said, 12 years ago. He said, "I wasn't reading the extension reports 12 years ago." She said, "No." He said, "I am now." She looked at the clipping, she looked at him. He went to the basin and washed his hands, and she turned back to the ledger and wrote the last figure in the column and closed it. The lamp between them made the table look smaller than it was, the way lamplight does, pulling things together, making the distance between objects shorter than it appears in daylight. She did not name what that meant. She simply noted it, the way she noted most things, and left it where it was. The wheat came up in October, thin green lines across both fields, and when the first frost came, the plants went dormant the way they were supposed to, and she stood at the east fence in the early morning, with her breath in the cold air, and looked at what had been a ruined field the winter before. Voss came up beside her. he said. You going to answer my question now, she said. Which one? He said. You know which one. She looked at the dormant wheat. The roots were down there in the dark, holding, not growing yet, just holding against the cold and waiting for the season to tell them they could. She had put her hand in that soil in the fall, and it had been a different thing than the soil she had put her hand in the year before. Darker, more alive in the way soil is alive when it has been given back what it lost. She said, yes. Voss said, yes, you're going to answer the question, or yes, you're going to stay. She said both. He nodded once and went back toward the barn. The cold came in from the north, and the wheat fields lay still under it, and she stood there a moment longer before turning back toward the house, where the lamp was already lit in the kitchen window, and the smoke was beginning to rise from the chimney in the particular straight column that meant the air was still and the morning was going to be clear.